That is very smart that she mentioned that, and that she said primarily and not, it's just that group of people. Shows that she's quite cognizant of an issue that many folks have been yelling about for a while. Okay. This particular video is going to be part one in a two-part series, actually, on what you see. Well, it was front and center, dang scrolling thing here. Um, what was delivered by the president of the National Academy of Sciences recently, better known as the State of the Science Address. That's actually what I want to talk about today. I have the YouTube of it in a different tab here. And what I'm going to do is play through part of it in this video and play through the rest of it in another video with some of my commentary over top. It's a really interesting thing. And Marcia McNutt is pretty interesting leader of the National Academies, as it were, right now. So, but for those of you who may be unfamiliar with what the National Academies is, let me go to their About Us section, because what it is the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, this is the United States, the National Academies provide independent, objective advice to inform policy with evidence, spark progress and innovation, and confront challenging issues for the benefits of society. As the operating and programmatic arm of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the National Research Council has established these guiding principles. Our vision: a nation and world that rely on scientific evidence to make decisions that benefit humanity. Our mission: the National Academies provide independent, trustworthy evidence and facilitate solutions to complex challenges by mobilizing expertise, practice, and knowledge in science, engineering, and medicine. Our core values: independence, objectivity, rigor, integrity, inclusivity, and the truth. And truth. Truth should be the first one there, frankly. Um, as separate operating units, the National Academies of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the National Academy of Medicine have crafted mission, vision, and values statements informed by their members and specific to their disciplines. You can find them on their websites linked at the bottom of this page. Now, this is all to say that the National Academies as a whole has multiple things that are part of it that encompass science, engineering, and medicine in particular. And it is supposed to be an advisory board, effectively, about science and what kind of policies should be taken for the benefit of science in the United States. So, all that said, I want to get over here to the actual State of the Science talk. Now, savvy viewers here can probably see that this is 47 minutes long, and that's why I'm not going to do this all in one video. I'm going to do this as a two-parter because I will admit I actually pre-watched some of this, so I do know exactly where it's going. And it's right around the 20-minute mark where Marcia McNutt changes tacks and direction to look at specifically some solutions to the problems that she highlights in the first part. So this was delivered on June 3rd, 2025. And this will be a little bit interesting. So I'm going to play and pause and give commentary a little bit as we go along, describing some of the state of the science issues that we see here. There may be a cat that runs through the background. We'll see. I don't know at this point. But let us begin.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Academy of Sciences. I have to say I am so pleased to see such a great turnout of people in our community who really care about the future of science in America. Hopefully I will leave you with lots of things to think about after my presentation today. But to back up, a year ago, after I gave the first State of the Science address, I thought to myself, wow, would there be any reason to do a second one? After all, the metrics change very slowly. Well, I could not have been more wrong.
Just to make a point, I actually think it's a good idea to think about the state of science on a really routine basis and how it's changing, how it's growing. So I would not have a problem with an address like this every year, but Continuing.
With today's perspective, we realize that all of the issues we were facing last year have been replaced with new ones. New policies that have impact the state of science in America are being issued, revised, revoked, and replaced at such a fast and furious pace that I cannot guarantee that any of the numbers I'm going to show you today will actually still be relevant tonight or tomorrow.
That's why it's been difficult for me to comment on so many different things, because there have been so many changes so quickly.
But one thing I will assure you, the actions I'm going to suggest for how to improve the state of the science in America will be fairly robust regardless of what the future brings in terms of 2026 budgets or policies. So let's start this presentation on where we agree. Everyone, whether it's scientists or non-scientists alike, wants U.S. science to be the world leader.
True.
By being the world leader, we can innovate and develop the future that we all want to see. My experience has been that when everyone agrees...
Did she say what I think she said? Everyone, whether it's science, wants hold on.
Science to be the world leader. By being the world leader, we can innovate and develop the future that we all want to see. My experience has been that when everyone agrees on that top line goal, magic can happen. And the only debate is on how we get there.
And that's actually a fair, you can see the next point she's about to make is the cuts to research budgets and things like that from the president's budget onto any other number of different things. But anyway, it's true. I think a lot of folks in the United States can agree we want American scientists and American scientific practice to be the best in the world. And it is a question of how we get there. You may recall a while back I did a video on the funding history of science. That up until round about World War II, science was not funded, in large part, was not funded at all by the government. It was funded by universities, by private donors, by any number of different things. It wasn't even private business that was really doing a whole lot of it at that time. But it was after the Great Depression and when you got into World War II timeframe that you had the spin up and creation of things like the National Science Foundation and the government apparatus we know today for funding research in the United States.
But of course, the elephant in the room right now is whether the drastic reductions in research budgets and new research policies across the federal agencies.
Okay, I know where she got that from. That panel, that table there is not from the budget. Okay, backstory, remember something here, because she's talking about the president's budget. The White House put this budget and sent it over to Congress. This is our priorities kind of thing, right? The thing about that is that's not ultimately what's going to happen. It's highly unlikely to be what's going to happen because Congress has their priorities and Congress sets the budget. Congress is ultimately what sets the budget. This is what they can put forward as their priorities for different things, but this is not ultimately what the president, what is going to be passed out of Congress. Ultimately not what's going to be signed into law for the FY26 budget, just to remind folks of that.
Will allow us to remain a research and development powerhouse. Even here at the National Academies, we've been badly impacted by budget cuts, grant cancellations, conforming to new policies, etc.
That is true.
Thus, we are embarking on a radical new experiment in what conditions promote science leadership, with the U.S. being the treatment group and China is the control.
Bad comparison, I'll tell you why. The U.S., regardless of issues with how much budget there is, has a much higher rating in academic freedom than China has had ever. So let me put it quite bluntly, China doesn't the Chinese Communist Party, the government there, controls a huge amount of the university enterprise and systems there, and the scientific enterprise and what have you. And you can't say anything against the Chinese Communist Party if you want to maintain your research there. So there is no academic freedom in China. That is not necessarily a correct thing here. She's talking about it with respect to the funding. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party does put a lot of funding into research related things, but the cost is trading off your own freedom to think.
I certainly hope that just like any other experiment,
that's the reason I say that the whole thing about it being a control versus a treatment isn't correct. Because there is one very key difference there, and that the level of academic freedom in the United States is much, much better than in China.
all results will be carefully monitored. They will be made instantly available, honestly reported, and a course correction will be instituted should these policies not turn out with that top line that we all agree we want to see. But regardless of what the budget proposals end up being for 2026, let me state succinctly up front that no matter what the final budget numbers, the U.S. is not on a sustainable path for global research leadership, and it has not been on such a path for quite a few years now.
Yes, agreed.
So,
before she begins with this, I am going to go back and read this report myself, just out of my curiosity, because this was the first time that I had ever really heard of this 2007 report that the National Academies did, I believe. National Academies did. So I want to go back and take a look at it. But it obviously is a reference to go to for what she's talking about. This is one of the reasons I liked her presentation when I saw it at first. She's got references for everything, which is really great.
Framing this talk, I went back to a 2007 report that the National Academies issued called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. When this report was written almost 20 years ago now, the handwriting was already on the wall. The exceptional authors of this very insightful study predicted exactly what would happen as knowledge and low-cost labor become widely available. And the answer was erosion in U.S. leadership. One of the elements of this report was a scenario that was called business as usual. This is one in which the U.S. continued to follow Vannevar Bush's Endless Frontier playbook,
I don't know who Vannevar
even
Bush is.
as other nations around the globe
Endless Frontier.
eagerly
I've heard
followed
that before.
our lead and wanted to implement the same model. In this scenario, the authors of the report predicted that the U.S. would experience reductions in global share of R&D, research outputs, research workforce, and the ability to compete globally for the greatest minds. What I'm going to argue now is that last year's State of the Science report documented that each of those predictions have been borne out under the business as usual scenario. So
she's talking about referencing her report from last year in 2024. She's bringing it up again to make a point.
first, U.S. share of R&D has declined. So the vertical line here shows when that report was put out. And it shows that when it was written, the U.S. invested more than twice as much as.
So I always had a question about this chart, and again, I gotta go look up the reference that she's referring to here as to whether or not this R&D thing included the government and private businesses, or if it private businesses, NGOs, and the like, or if it just included the government. I think it includes a touch of both, but I'm not really 100% sure. So just for reference.
As anyone else in R&D. And our next closest competitor wasn't even China at that time. And of course, today the situation is markedly different. The U.S. no longer dominates investment in R&D, and we've got lots of competition worldwide. Okay, the second prediction from the business as usual scenario is that U.S. would no longer lead in numbers of researchers and publication output.
See, this is interesting what she's about to argue here, but there's one problem I want to talk about with it when it gets to the other side.
What I love about this analysis that I put up here is that it was conducted last year by our colleagues in Japan. And Japan did this study because they wanted to find out where are they in the pecking order of great R&D nations. Therefore, I don't expect, since the Japanese did this, that they were going to be in any way partial to China. And I expect they also would be quite clear-eyed about what was going on here in America. And what they found is China is leading in numbers of researchers, numbers of research papers, and numbers of top papers. Note that in 2 of those categories, the U.S. isn't even second.
Okay. Before she goes into the next thing, there's something I did want to say on that particular aspect. It's one thing to publish a lot of papers. It's one thing to matter as to whether or not they are quality. And that's the thing, is because we've produced so many PhDs in the US and globally, and so many in all sorts of different fields at this point, that there is a certain glut of papers being produced quickly. There's things called paper mills and all this other kind of stuff. So my question is immediately like, how many of those are actually quality papers? The other thing I have a question about with that is that per capita, that number, because there's different amounts of population in different countries and things like that. Is that per capita or is it not? How they did that analysis. So again, question I have on that front. With that, the one thing I would note about here is that the reason I bring up the issue of quality is we do have a sort of career incentive for a lot of academic researchers, academic scientists, even to a degree government scientists and business researchers, is publish or perish. If you don't get X number of papers published, you start losing your credibility and what have you. But that incentivizes quantity over quality. And that is why I immediately have questions. Is that really what we think it is? Not to say it's not a concern, but is it really what we think it is?
Okay, the third prediction, the last one, was from Rising Above the Gathering Storm, has also been confirmed. At the time that the committee wrote the report, interest from international students trained in the U.S. to stay here and contribute to our economy was still on the rise. International transplants are disproportionately responsible for U.S. Nobel Prizes and Fortune 500 companies. But within just a few years of Rising Above the Gathering Storm, that interest started to wane. Less so for India, but drastically for top Chinese scientists. Note that the reason for this loss in international talent is not just opportunities abroad, but challenges of obtaining visas here and unforced error on our part.
So I will say that thing with the visas and immigration is not wrong. It is actually quite difficult to get a visa in the United States. But I would also go back and point out to the video that I did last week on universities and civics. Yes, scientific knowledge belongs to everybody, but who are American universities meant to serve in amongst students? Are they meant to serve U.S. primarily? Doesn't mean you can't have foreign students. Absolutely have foreign students, bring in the best and brightest. That's not what I'm saying. It's not that, not the other thing. Don't go there. But who are they meant to primarily serve is the question. And the same goes for the national academies here, which is part of the U.S.
So basically all of the predictions from the business as usual scenario played out. And yet we did very little as a nation post 2007 to change the trajectory and blaze a new, more productive path that would allow us to get out ahead again and maintain R&D leadership. But Rising Above the Gathering Storm also had a second scenario, the pessimistic scenario. They presented a case of what the future might hold in a worst case scenario. This pessimistic scenario is triggered by budget cuts in order to address other national priorities.
See, here's the thing that's interesting is I did this video on science history and funding history a while back, pre 2024. The amount of basic research being funded by the government was on a decline in the United States. So bear that in mind.
Is further accelerated by U.S. researchers preferring to pursue their careers elsewhere, by changes mostly in tax law that discourage industry R&D investment, by skyrocketing regulations that divert time and dollars away from doing science. So, could any of that be happening today? Okay, so let's look at the first trigger. Other federal priorities limit science funding.
Limit science funding from the federal government. I'm going to add that to what you said because that's actually more accurate. But the other problem that she gets to is what limits other things like private businesses from doing more science funding themselves.
So we all know what's happening with the budget. Science budgets, particularly those that fund the academic research community, are slated for drastic reductions in order to fund tax breaks and other priorities. Okay, the second trigger for the pessimistic scenario is attractive opportunities abroad drawing researchers away from the U.S. Uncertainties over the science budgets for next year, coupled with cancellations of billions of dollars of already hard-won research grants, is causing an exodus of researchers from the U.S. The orange line here is, well, you can see these two lines. One is the exodus of scientists from America to the rest of the world, which is the blue line, and the orange line is the intake of foreign researchers to the U.S. You can see that they were moving last year mostly in sync with normal annual cycles. But then suddenly they started to diverge. And now we are seeing a much larger exodus of researchers from America than we're seeing researchers coming here. A very prominent U.S. researcher posted on social media that his grant had been canceled for no good reason. Within 30 minutes, he had a job offer from China.
That's all well and good. Again, you have no academic freedom in China. You have absolutely no academic freedom in China. He can go there, he can take the job with China, but seriously, you have no academic freedom in China. Yeah, you might have security in your job, but you actually don't have all that much freedom to think and to innovate as you'd think.
30 minutes. In terms of lack of business incentives that lead to discouraged R&D investment by industry, the story is a little bit more mixed. New legal requirements that were in place in 2022 to 2025 have made it less desirable from a tax perspective to conduct R&D in the U.S.
R&D
and
is very,
have also increased the
R&D for a lot of companies can actually be very high risk when you're talking about basic research in particular. And so having no incentive to do it or lack of incentive to do it makes it very expensive for different companies and less desirable to do.
Regulatory burden. But offsetting those were credits for new R&D startups. Currently, the first item on the list is being reconsidered in Congress and could be changed to restore a more R&D friendly tax environment for industry. And then the fourth trigger in the pessimistic scenario is that excessive regulations reduce research output. Well, this has been a fact of life for some time. 62% of all regulations imposed on researchers since 1991 have been issued in the last 10 years alone.
Think about that when you're talking about the issues with funding and what have you, and the indirect costs and things like that versus how much the researcher actually gets to do the work. So I've talked about indirect costs before, but it's basically a percentage of the budget that goes toward paying for things that cannot be directly charged to the grant, like the administrative services behind the scenes that helps manage the regulatory stuff, right? A lot of universities have to maintain those kinds of departments and what have you, with as much staffing as they can give, with as much time as they can give. And of course, that's money that needs to be paid for salaries and what have you, for very good reasons. There are a lot of very good people that help out in those things. But a lot of the reason for needing that, at least in my judgment with this, is to make sure and assist the professors and PIs applying that stuff can meet all the regulatory requirements and paperwork therein. But anyway, that's one thing for that. And it also takes time away from the PIs and research too.
Some of the regulations do not even pass the sniff test for payoff compared to effort. For example, we require full IRB or Institutional Review Board approval prior to sending out even voluntary surveys to Americans.
I don't know that I find that to be entirely
We
accurate.
require extensive disclosure of financial interests that are entirely unrelated to the research being done.
Yep.
And we require approval of animal research experiments, even when they involve non-invasive use of the animals, or simple renewals of what had already been approved last year. And the problems with red tape go well beyond just regulatory compliance for researchers. International students.
This is an addendum to all of the other stuff that a lot of administrative staff in universities helps out with. So
Students and visitors can't even get a visa to come here. One international visitor who was at a recent meeting was being congratulated by his colleagues for having gotten a visa to come here, until he explained that he had been invited to the same meeting the year before, but it took him more than a year to get his visa to come to the meeting. International students graduating from U.S. institutions cannot get visas to stay here for work. And but we know that the administration has prioritized a reduction in regulatory burden. And I hope that that priority extends to the research regulation.
Yep,
In fact,
so too.
I worry that the emphasis right now on waste, fraud, and abuse only leads to more regulations, as everyone is assumed guilty until proven innocent. So Rising Above the Gathering Storm also predicted, if we found ourselves in this pessimistic scenario, and hopefully I've convinced you that we're right on the verge of that, they predicted what would happen to America R&D. They said that talent and investment would start to leave the U.S. The U.S. would lose out in global markets, and ultimately our standard of living would start dropping. Now, evidence suggests that we are experiencing those outcomes from the pessimistic scenario. For example, let's look at where the best science is being done.
So this graphic is really, really tiny, so that's why I leaned toward the camera all of a sudden. But if you look at this, obviously this reference will be in the link on this. Will be linked to this video for you, so go look. But you can see it right here is the country that's leading, and the risk issue here with the type of technology here on the one side. So China's leading in an awful lot of things.
This is a chart that was put together by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Again, a group that I don't think would be showing preference to China or to the U.S. It tracks critical technologies and who is in the lead. For these technologies, they span topics such as materials, manufacturing, AI, energy, quantum, biotech, sensing, and defense. China leads the race in all high-risk critical areas and in most of the medium and low-risk ones as well. Foreign multinationals begin to dominate the global markets was another prediction. Well, in 2002, before that report was written, the U.S. could lay claim to half of the global Fortune 500 companies. But
Not
now
so much
China
anymore.
dominates in the global Fortune 500.
China doesn't quite.
I would
That's not quite
argue
right.
we
It's
don't want to
bit of a
wait
mixed bag.
until U.S. standard of living starts to decrease to do something about this situation. We need to act now.
Now, why is she talking about that with this? Because as much as a lot of folks don't realize this, but a lot of the scientific and research innovation, even if you don't see the folks doing the research behind the scene, ultimately leads to some great innovations that improve the quality of life for everybody involved. And that's a lot of what she's talking about right here. Is the standard of living in the United States has become very high for a lot of parts of the U.S. because of in part because of our technological innovation. I always say in part because there's always more than one moving part in a large society, and science is a huge part of it, but it is not the only one in here. So let's continue.
This is a much more serious situation than I even anticipated last year. The Endless Frontier from Vannevar Bush provided us with a solid 60 or more years during which U.S. science was the undisputed world leader. Unless we want the 21st century to be the China century, we need to innovate, something that the U.S. is actually pretty good at. And we need to apply that innovation to our own science system. So before I start talking about what the changes are that we need to make, let's look at a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats.
Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, FYI.
For the U.S. research system. In reimagining a improved U.S. innovation system, we want to build on the strengths, we want to correct the weaknesses, take advantage of opportunities, and avoid the threats. In terms of strengths, we still have a really strong culture of innovation here. We have world-leading universities.
Leading in what exactly would be my question. And I'm not so sure about the culture of innovation thing here, because I question, we seem to have a culture of safetyism growing in the US, which is what concerns me. I talked about it. Coddling of the American Mind and Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge both talked about that in those respective books, Jonathan Haidt and Jonathan Rauch, respectively. So that culture of safetyism seems to me to be opposed to the culture of innovation. And because to innovate, you have to take risks. You have to take lots of risks, and they don't always work out well. It's not the safest thing.
We should be promoting, not punishing. We have a strong industrial R&D base, and equally important, we have the capital that can move good ideas to new products and solutions. We have a history of returning $5 to the economy for every dollar spent.
That's what I mean by the improvements in quality of life, efficiency, the economic side of things, and what have you. You can see that in the return on investment. You just don't necessarily connect it directly to the fact that it's scientists who've provided a lot of that backbone.
On research. Whatever we do, we should not enact policies that diminish any of those strengths. But we also have some weaknesses. Our own below-par education system that doesn't adequately prepare students for the current environment.
No kidding. K through 12 education is a mess right now. More on that in the next video.
We have no research strategy that involves the many funders and the many performers of research. We've got too many regulations, too much dependence on foreign talent, low trust in science, primarily among conservative voters.
That is very smart that she mentioned that, and that she said primarily, and not, it's just that group of people. Shows that she's quite cognizant of an issue that many folks have been yelling about for a while, that trust in science has fallen off to a fair degree. But we'll see this more in the next video, that she doesn't get into the why of that as much, and that annoys me.
These are all unforced, self-imposed errors we need to turn around without torpedoing our strengths. In terms of threats, we can't change the fact that there's now more competition from other nations following our lead. We set a good example. No surprise, they wanted to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And it is only expected that once all the easy science experiments are done, that new experiments to push the boundaries of understanding require more complex instrumentation and more expensive research facilities. But herein are also opportunities. We can use the rise of science prowess internationally to create better partnerships to support the burden of cost for all of those expensive facilities. We can also seize on the anti-regulatory agenda of the administration to cut the burden that weighs down our scientific productivity. There is much to work with here. So what are some of the actions we should take now to build a better research enterprise and regain U.S. leadership? Oh, and that's what we need to do. Okay.
Okay. I'm going to stop this first video here, and we'll do part 2, will be the rest of her talk on the actions that she suggests in my commentary on those actions. But she's cognizant of a whole lot of problems that are not just the issues with the current time that we're in, but things that have built up over time and have become a problem in this current time. And so that's where she does really, really well with it. There's a few things I know she's missing in the later section of her talk that I think we'll get into on the next video for sure. But let me know what you think. Did she miss anything critical to you? Did she miss anything that's important with respect to the current state of science in the United States? Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrienne. Stay curious.